This is the first episode of a series about damage types in Souls games and how I built the damage system for my game Song of the Tides. In the Souls games, there are a variety of damage types present. The general system is inherited from traditional turn-based JRPGs, where these types of damage were necessary to create artificial complexity in the combat system, since otherwise there would have been very little choice for the player in how to customize their build to be more effective against certain enemies. Even back then, the system already had huge problems, since a lot of the underlying stats and math formulas were not exposed to the player, so the actual ability to make informed choices was extremely limited. This was to give players an incentive to buy guidebooks that contained these type of information, thereby giving players an edge in times where you couldn't just look this stuff up on the internet. For players, the only way to find out how effective an attack is was to use it on an enemy and see if it did comparatively more damage than it usually would or than other attacks. The process of figuring this out would probably deem the player's first attempt as a failure in tougher battles. So with the player not knowing when, where, and which enemy they would encounter, it was essentially impossible to employ any other method than trial and error to figure out effective strategies against enemies. Or you could just stop engaging with the system and instead invest more time into grinding experience to level up your character until they are so powerful that the damage system can just be ignored. As you might imagine, banging your head against the wall until you find a soft spot that you can break is hardly an engaging experience for any player. With the alternative of guidebooks foreshadowing the eventual development of pay-to-win mechanics that are prevalent today. This brings us to today's Souls games. The amount of damage types has been reduced, but it's still a little overwhelming. They work in the way that every damage type has a corresponding resistance to it, and every armor has a certain amount of resistance to every damage type. If we look at the top 8 resistance/damage types, they are functionally identical. Your resistance to a damage type will reduce the amount of damage you receive from it, and that's it. Being hit by blunt damage will not inflict any additional stun, and being burned by fire will not apply a burning effect or anything like that. From here, we'll call this type of damage dumb damage. Now, looking at the bottom 4 resistances, we actually have different mechanics here. Poison damage will build up a meter that, once filled, will apply a damage over time effect to the target. Curse will reduce the player's maximum health, and Frost will reduce the player's stamina regeneration. From here, we'll refer to this type of damage as smart damage. My philosophy to game design is that offering the player meaningful choices will increase their engagement with the game's systems, and in turn, the fun they will be having with the game when they can use these systems for their benefit. The underlying idea behind any damage type system is to enhance player engagement by creating effective and ineffective strategies for the players to figure out, and in theory this should work, right? The problem is, in real life, most of the time, it does not work. As I mentioned before, players can only make choices using the information available to them. If the game offers no such information to the player, and the only way of acquiring it is trial and error, that is what I would call a problem. This information scarcity leads to a phenomenon many Souls games struggle with, which is an inverted difficulty curve. Traditionally, games started out easy to entice new players and then got harder as they progressed. Souls games have more of an inverted difficulty curve, where they get easier as the player progresses, and the information scarcity is one of, but not the only system contributing to this. To give an example, for a new player facing the booby spider lady in Dark Souls, it's probably very hard to figure out what type of damage she might be vulnerable to. One of the common tropes in games is that fire is effective against spiders, and another trope is that enemies that deal a certain type of damage are not vulnerable to that type of damage. So a fire spider is weak against, lightning, of course. Pair this with the fact that the new player will most likely not have any access to a lightning attack if they didn't spec into miracles, and it's easy to see that the supposed player choice actually doesn't really exist, thereby making the game disproportionately harder for new players. In the context of Quelaag from Dark Souls, what could be done to help the players make an informed decision about their equipment before being stomped into the ground by the weirdest fetish? One possible solution would be to have players fight smaller, less dangerous fire spiders, where they can test out different equipment in a low-risk environment. This would of course ruin the surprise of facing the sexy brute mother. Another solution could be given via lore. In another more exposition-heavy RPG, you could, for example, have other adventurers talk about rumors of an 8-legged wicked woman that ravaged the town and only withdrew once a thundering storm rolled in. Again, not a suitable solution for a Souls game. The point is, dumb damage is not necessarily bad, but to be able to fulfill its purpose correctly, players need to have access to enough information to make an informed decision. In theory, it should get a little more interesting when we get to smart damage, but in the Souls games, players cannot inflict any curse damage and enemies don't have stamina, so essentially all types of smart damage will just deal extra damage after it has been built up. So in a PvE context in the Souls games, it functions just like more dumb damage types. A similar example would be Godfall, where there are different damage types like poison, frost or fire that are supposed to act like smart damage, but in fact they all just apply damage over time. So in a way they could all be summarized as one type of smart damage executed in 6 dumb ways. A good example of a well-implemented damage system could be Hades, where there are a variety of stacking buffs available to the player, all with different behaviors and synergies, as well as a pretty cool crit damage system. Alright, so equipped with this knowledge, I'm going to dive into how I built the damage system for my game Song of the Tides in next week's episode.